The final aspect I want to discuss today are Milgram's famous experiments, since they cut across compliance and conformity and obedience, in fact. So they can give us all some food for thought regarding social influence. And as you probably seen by now, there's an essay question on this that would encourage you to give a lot more thought to what these experiments can actually tell us. The basic experimental setup was very much centered around this rather infamous machine. Participants would arrive and would be invited to take part in an experiment on learning. They were led to believe that they were randomly allocated to either be a teacher or a learner, but in fact that was wrecked. All the participants were allocated to be teachers. The teachers were then placed in front of this machine, and this machine was explained as an electroshock machine. And at the bottom there, it has lots of switches that are meant to issue electric shocks of increasing strength. And they're labeled as painful, dangerous, all the way to potentially deadly at the end. And then in the experiment, the experimenter, labeled with the E here, would ask the learner questions. The learner was sitting in a different room, but clearly audible. So the experimenter would ask a learner question. The learner would get some of the questions wrong, and then the so-called teacher, the participants in the experiment, would be instructed to give the learner an electric shock to promote learning. And basically, the question was, would the teachers, the participants, go along with the experiment? And if so, how far? And shockingly, 2/3 of participants went along all the way, even though the learner was screaming in pain, play acting, but they heard the learner screaming in pain. And the machine was clearly labeled in a way that suggested that it was not a good idea to give these intense shocks. So what does this tell us? It's been interpreted in many different ways. It might just tell us that people are evil and really enjoy punishing others. But that's a silly explanation, because Milgram ran an alternative experiment asking the teachers to issue whatever electric shocks they would like to issue, and pretty much no one went to the highest level. There was an alternative experiment as well, where other teachers refused to issue the intense shocks. And in that situation, most people also resisted. So the experiment doesn't seem to tell us that people like to hurt other people. It doesn't seem to tell us that they will follow an experimenter and do whatever they are told, since other supposed participants could rebel, and then that was enough to make most participants stop. And then there are lots of other variations. Milgram conducted more than 20 different variations of the experiment, and looking at them critically can already help to understand what's going on. But a key point that I want to make for the purpose of today's lecture is that there is little evidence that the experiment was about mindless obedience. there's a lot of evidence that some of the processes that we talked about so far, about social relationships and conformity, were at play. And one way of studying that is to look at what experimenters actually did during the experiment. They didn't just say, well, now you give the next shot, but they had a set of prompts to encourage participants to go on. Most participants expressed doubt. Very few participants just happily inflicted more and more pain on the learner. Most participants expressed doubts. And then the experimenters would say, please continue. They were instructed to then next say, the experiment requires that you continue. The third level of escalation was, it's essential that you continue. And the fourth level was to pretty much issue an order. The kind of thing you think of when you think of obedience. They were told, you have no choice, you must go on. In replication, not a single participant was convinced by this last prompt. Still, like in the original study, many participants went on to inflict, well, in that study actually they weren't allowed to go on to the levels that would be ethically problematic, where they would inflict massive pain. But the way at least Berger and his colleagues would want us to interpret the results is that they found very similar willingness to go to these extremes. But no one who needed to be given a command obeyed the command. So why did they go along if it wasn't about obeying the experimenter? Haslam and colleagues went back to the original recordings from the Milgram study, and they discovered what they called engaged followership. So they discovered that participants thought that they signed up, became part of some worthy endeavor. They were now volunteer scientists, to give it a group label, but they were contributing to science. And then once they were in that situation, they wanted to act in accordance with what that group membership was all about. And a big part of what being a research volunteer is about is doing what needs to be done for the experiment. And this is not about excusing people. Clearly, objectively, doing what they did is immoral, and we should think about ways of educating people in a way that prevents them from inflicting pain onto others just because they are told. But for that, we need to recognize what's really at play. And I would suggest that the experiment is one of the examples for how powerful social identities are and how they can lead to conformity. Looking forward to discussing these different concepts with you